Welcome back to another episode of Heart of the Matter. Today we are honored to welcome to our show Jill Abramson. Jill Abramson is the former executive editor of the New York Times, having served in the position from 2011 to 2014. During the course of her 17 years at the paper, she also served as managing editor and Washington bureau chief. She is the first female in Times history to hold each of these respective senior editorial posts. For the New York Times, Ms. Abramson worked as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal covering money and politics. The author of 3 books, including a retrospective on the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, Ms. Abramson was listed in 2011 by Forbes magazine as the 5th most powerful woman in the world. She is currently a faculty member of the Harvard English Department, of which she is an alumnus. Ms. Abramson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The New York Times reported that its fourth quarter 2014 revenues increased largely because of the growth in its digital segments, a feature that you were a big contributor to, which has offset a significant drop in print circulation and advertising. As the digital revolution in journalism continues to transform how newsrooms do their jobs and readers receive their information, what future do you imagine for the growth and impact of the digital strategy of the mainstream press?
Well, I think that the Times has achieved quite a bit of success with its digital subscription plan, which essentially asks the heaviest users and readers of the Times to pay for the content. And why that works at the Times is that the Times' journalism is of such high quality and unique value that the Times can ask people to pay, and according to the report that you just referenced, the fourth quarter, plenty of people, like about 900,000 people, are digital subscribers to the New York Times, and that's a significant revenue stream that the Times wouldn't otherwise have. It used to be, before the digital subscription plan, that only online advertising was generating revenue for the digital version of the Times. And now, kind of like the newspaper, there are 2 digital streams, revenue streams rather. There's advertising and subscription income.
It's a sustainable model to keep elite newspapers afloat long term.
It's sustainable for the Times, but not for everybody, because you have to have journalism and content that is of such high quality. You can't get it anywhere else, so that people are going to pay, because there's so much free news on the web and on every kind of platform. So, it has to be something special.
I gather the sense that you're optimistic about the electronic future of the New York Times. What concerns you the most about the growth in digital journalism? What has been lost over the years, and what must be protected?
Well, there are many different challenges that the digital landscape poses, and one that I think is worthy of thought is how you balance speed and accuracy. That the pounding competition of the 24/7 news cycle and the desire to be first with news or an important development on a story, that can create an environment where there are too many mistakes, erroneous information gets picked up, and then with the power of social media, which is playing such a big role in the distribution of news right now, something wrong can get caught up in an echo chamber and picked up in 100 places before it's corrected, and that's something I certainly worry about.
Do WikiLeaks and activist-minded news websites threaten the functioning of the New York Times and other elite newspapers?
Well, not every news organization can afford to have, editors who safeguard accuracy and bother to go through those somewhat complex steps that take time. And I think readers are well served by experienced editors as gatekeepers to information, because you can just be buried in information. I mean, just the sheer number of like Diplo cables that were part of the WikiLeaks material, just reading all of those as raw material would take forever. Having, experienced editors and correspondents go through them and distill them and tell you which are the important ones and what they mean, and that is of big value. It helps, the intelligent reader absorb information. So just having, the problem is that, the information age is great, the one we live in, where there's so much information available from so many different sources, but information is different from knowledge, and I think getting to the knowledge part has always, experienced journalists have helped guide people through a mountain of information to knowledge, and that it's a profession that is learned over time and should be valued in our society.
How has the style of investigative reporting evolved since you began your careers? Is it somewhat stable, or are younger journalists and emerging organizations doing it differently?
It's a great question. What has changed is the length of space, the news hole that publishers are willing to devote to investigative journalism has shrunk. The budget for investigative journalism has shrunk. It's expensive. It takes a long time to do an investigative story, and it's a luxury that some news organizations have felt they can't afford anymore, which is why you've seen wonderful organizations like ProPublica rise up to kind of fill that vacuum. That's what's changed.
President Obama's administration is known for its lack of transparency with journalists, including limited disclosure of information, aggressive prosecution of journalists like James Risen and whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, as well as wide-ranging electronic surveillance. This is an issue that Obama vowed to be different than his predecessor. As someone who's covered both administrations, how would you compare press freedom under Obama versus President Bush?
I mean, they both ran untransparent administrations. President Bush, had to deal with the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and I think as a journalist covering what his administration did, I think they leaned too far in protecting national security versus protecting civil liberties. President Obama, when he ran in 2008, vowed to rebalance, but I think he did not, and especially in one of the areas you mentioned, criminal leak prosecutions. There were 8 of those prosecutions, and mainly the active parts of those prosecutions were under President Obama, and that's more than twice the number in all of history before his presidency. I just think that is a very regrettable legacy.
Quote your former colleague David Sanger, "This is the most closed, control-freak administration I've ever seen." Do you agree with this statement?
That is accurate. The Obama White House was, at least from my perch as managing editor and executive editor of the time, the most secret of all the administrations I covered, and I worked in Washington for 21 years, so I've seen a lot. I've covered administrations going back to President Reagan.
In 2012, Reporters Without Borders listed the United States as 47th in the world on the World Press Freedom Index, which is surely a staggering figure. Execution of the Japanese journalist Kenji Goto from ISIS, as well as the American James Foley, outraged many across the world.
And the Jordanian pilot.
Yes, absolutely. What challenges exist for news organizations, including media outlets, for television and newspapers, in sending them to forward areas where terrorist organizations are looking to kidnap foreign journalists.
It's the thing that kept my heart in my throat the entire time. I, was in senior leadership positions at the Times, and, I had to live through the kidnapping of some of our journalists in Libya. Even after I've been gone from the Times, seeing, my lifelong friend Alyssa Rubin go down, in an airplane. She's, thank God, recovering now, but that's awful. The bravery of my colleagues is something that just really always moved me, and the fact that there were always people who wanted to go to war zones and write stories about the most dangerous places. But, journalists are now targets. There's no arguing with that. And thank goodness the Times gives extensive training to any of its journalists who are going to dangerous hotspots about, what the protocol is if, God forbid, you're kidnapped. But I worry terribly about inexperienced freelancers who know that if they go to a war zone, they're likely to get assignments, but they may not have the savvy to keep themselves safe. And then there's always just the tragic situation where someone is experienced and takes all the precautions, and still they wind up dead, like a Daniel Pearl.
And certainly I think that protecting journalists who are in dangerous positions on our own soil is a national concern as well. The arrest of journalists covering the Ferguson protests and the Eric Garner protests has certainly caused a lot of outrage. Switching notes. You've always stressed throughout your career about the story behind the story, right, as a way for story selection and telling a narrative. Many great stories are not easy reads, or they require extended context. With the competition of the 24/7 news market and the generally short attention spans that plague young readers, how do you maintain quality control while trying to make a profit as well?
I think, in the end, the most grippingly told and well-reported stories, like your classic whale of a tale, is you publish something that everyone feels like, I have to read it. And, that is what makes a fantastic publication. And that is what you make money on. You have to have journalism that's of a singular quality and stories that you don't find everywhere else. And I think, there are many great news organizations that are full of such stories. So I feel pretty optimistic about that. I think the strength that I brought both to reporting and editing was I have like a good story gut. I hear something and it's like, zoom, that is a story. And it served me well in both jobs. And interestingly, throughout my career, I've gone back and forth between the two. And actually, this summer, I wrote, my first long investigative piece that I'd done in a long time, and, loved doing it.
On a closing note, I'd like to ask you about the feasibility of a career in journalism. So many young people,
I guess I don't mean to interrupt you.
Sure.
I'm only laughing because I'm glad you're not asking me the question as the feasibility of a journalism career that's guaranteed to end well.
We hear a lot of things about how it's hard to earn a good living or any living at all in this field. What do you say to aspiring students of journalism? What skills and experiences should we be developing in our college years to prepare us for the journalism industry?
I think it's the skill of storytelling and being able to go out and report and then write a narrative that is the story behind a story, and that is valued still, whether it's at BuzzFeed or the New York Times. It just is. And what's different, but this is different in so many professions in our society, is you can no longer expect to join one company and expect to have the rest of your life, your career there. That's a rarity. It's a rarity in journalism, but in lots of other fields too. And you just have to, have a lot of resilience and be intrepid.
We always end our interviews with a rapid fire round of questions, and I'd like to ask you, what did Ben Bradley's career and his leadership mean to you?
I just think he had a passion for the great story, and I think he backed up his reporters absolutely, and that was a great lesson to me. President Nixon and his whole administration came after the Washington Post and Woodward and Bernstein, and Ben Bradley never flinched.
Piece of literature that you recommend to all college students?
The Great Gatsby.
What's the most meaningful advice you received as a journalist in your career?
Hand in your expenses on time.
Who told you that?
Early on. Early days at the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you so much for joining us.
For having me.
I'm Gabriel Frankel. This has been Heart of the Matter. We'll see you next time.